Hello, and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 39, Wednesday, April 15th, 2020.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and...
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Emily.
Hey, Courtney, this month has been very exciting. We've had the opportunity to meet so many people and read a lot of great books. I think this is our fourth podcast this month.
It might be. We're at home, so plenty of time to podcast. And in that time, we've been very fortunate to have a series of author interviews over those past few episodes. And we're excited to close this chapter, pun intended, with our guest today. He's a film historian with interests focused on the industry's early years of silent films and, of course, Disney's contributions to animation history. In his writing, he's covered classics such as Snow White and Pinocchio, along with underappreciated gems like the Silly Symphony cartoons and South American package films. Today, we're excited to discuss a different package film featured in his recent book, The Making of Walt Disney's Fun and Fancy Free by J.B.Kaufman. Welcome, J.B.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be with you, and thanks very much for inviting me to be on the podcast.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us. Personally, I've had a number of your books on my wish list, specifically the Silly Symphonies Companion, but I was really happy to add Fun and Fancy Free to my bookshelf. I vividly remember watching Mickey and the Beanstalk a number of times as a kid, and we're going to talk about that because I think I saw a different version than the original Fun and Fancy Free. And it's always one of my favorite Mickey features. But before we get into the book, we'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you started writing Disney history.
Okay. I will spare you the long version, but the somewhat shorter version is you've already touched on part of it. I'm coming to this from the angle of a film historian, which is to say that that's what I really care about. I know that there are a number of Disney in the world that are all about parks and so on. And I like Disneyland. I like the Disney parks, and there's nothing wrong with them. But my real interest, my real passion is in film history, and particularly the history of the classic era of filmmaking. And as you know, Walt Disney was a big part of that period. So that's the angle that I'm coming to it from. When I was taken to see a reissue of Cinderella, and I was just completely blown away by the miracle of animated films on a big screen. I liked drawing pictures myself, but to see pictures that appeared to be moving and alive and were such beautiful pictures and projected on a surface like the side of a building was just a completely lack for me. So I was a Disney kid from that time on. A little later, I discovered the concept of film history, and still later, I realized that you could put those two things together because Walt Disney was such an important part of film history during its greatest years. So that's that in a nutshell, which may be a good place for it. That's the way I got started. And I can tell you that in writing books about Disney history, my main focus was on the history, not on the writing. I wasn't really that interested in writing until I started doing it. And it was then that I really did start taking an interest in the craft of wordsmithing and so on. So, but that came afterward as a result of getting into this field. the main thing that was on was to get inside the making of these great films and explore how they came to be.
I love that you mentioned, you kind of made the distinction of yourself as a fan between the movies and the parks as your bread and butter, so to speak, because oftentimes we have talked to a lot of people about the parks, but this is a little bit of a deeper dive for us. I wanted to jump right in that I noticed this publication is through the Hyperion Historical Alliance Press. Could you tell us a little more about that organization and how the publishing process worked with them?
Sure. Yeah, it is. And I believe you've already talked to DDA, so he may have told you a little bit about this. But it is a nonprofit organization of Disney historians, archivists, and writers who have kind of joined forces to pool their collective knowledge, because when you start looking into it, there's so much of Disney history to know about. It is an endless field, and the more eyes you have looking at it, the more specialties there are, and networking with each other, the more you can learn about everybody's individual subcategories. So it's turned out to be a tremendous thing. Now, the publication arm of this is a relatively recent thing. And as you may know, we basically do two things at this point. We have an annual periodical, which is for shorter articles, and we just published the first one last year. And we also have this series of monographs. And as the series title suggests, the idea of the monographs is to take individual topics in Disney history, topics that are a little more obscure and not so much the textbook classics that everybody knows about, and each monograph take one of those topics and really drill down and explore it in great detail, and hopefully give a definitive account of whatever that topic is. Now, as I say, there are members of the organization who are extremely knowledgeable about Imagineering and the history of the parks and whatnot. And I leave it to them to explore those topics. And then there are the films. And what I love about this is that we can take these films, which, in the case of Fun and Fancy Free, these are films that are never going to rate large-scale art books of their own. But the monographs are a perfect arena in which to get into these lesser-known films and really explore them in depth. So those are our two publication projects. Jim Hollifield and myself are the editors of the publication initiative that we have going, and I have been greatly honored to be the one to write the first of the monographs. This one on the making of Fun and Fancy Free.
So what led you to pick Fun and Fancy Free? Of all the package films you could have chosen from, why this particular feature?
Well, actually, I think somebody else suggested it. In fact, it might have been DDA who suggested it, but he didn't have to twist my arm. I've always liked this film. It's as you know, it has a charm all its own. That's the thing about these films, the package films. They're not all one thing. Each one has its own characteristics and its own special qualities. And Fun and Fancy Free is one that I've always loved. It's just, I have a real personal affection for it. So it was a real treat to be able to delve into the making of it and discover how it came about.
As you were diving into that, could you share a little more about your research process? There's so many gems in the images within the book, some original artwork and sketches as both of the films within the package film evolved, and we'd love to know more about finding that.
Well, it's by this time, I've written a few other books before, and by this time, the Disney Archives is kind of my home away from home. So it's one of the, and I tell people that I have the greatest job in the world, because writing a book about Disney history is really just an excuse to do the research. And so each time I take on one of these things and it is approved and so on, and I can get started, it's just a great excuse to go camp out at the archives. And the people there are so helpful and so knowledgeable, and are really forthcoming about finding the rare documents. And Disney is one studio that has preserved everything. I mean, I've done research on non-Disney related topics, and when you're dealing in the broader field of film history, you get used to the idea that it may be very, very difficult to find research material on whatever film you're looking for. But Disney is a studio that made a point of saving everything. So the first step is just to delve into the great amount of material they saved. And I should also add, and you may have heard this before, there's the Walt Disney Archives. That's one thing. And then there is a separate department called the Walt Disney Animation Research Library. And that's a whole separate entity. And as a rule, and there are exceptions to this, but as a rule, you find the written material, which is to say transcripts of story meetings and animators' drafts and so on. As a rule, you find those at the archives, whereas the artwork, the actual art that the animators and background painters and so on were creating, that will be at the Animation Research Library.
That's so interesting. And I think there is a misconception out there that because these package films aren't quite as popular, that there's not the documentation that there is. So I really appreciated seeing so much history in this book.
Well, I'm glad because that's what really fascinates me about it. And yeah, it is the case. And if you've read the book, you know this, that at the Disney studio during its peak years, no idea ever stood still. Ideas were constantly being adapted and morphing into other ideas, and sometimes overlapping with other ideas. And at the beginning of what led to this film, Bongo was supposed to be a whole separate feature film. So was Mickey and the Beanstalk, and they both evolved through various stages as film before coming together after the war was over and being combined into one feature-length package, which then had even more additional material added to it by way of the framing story with Jiminy Cricket. So that, to me, it was just fascinating to watch that whole process developing, and especially looking at it in hindsight and knowing what the end result was going to be.
From all the changes that these two features went through throughout the book, you very clearly show the process of changing animator hands and directors and story writers. Was that difficult to keep on top of while you were researching? Like, was it in chronological order, or were you finding as you went, now here's this person and that person, and you had to fit it chronologically?
Well, to some extent, I did have to straighten out the chronology, but that's part of the fun. It's detective work, basically. You start finding clues, and then you figure out how the clues fit together. So in particular, I think one of the things that fascinated me the most was that in the case of Mickey and the Beanstalk, they actually did start production, that is to say animation, before the war, or before the U.S. got into the war, when Disney was still in entertainment mode. And started then. Well, of course, when the U.S. did get into World War II, everything changed overnight, and the majority of Disney's efforts were going toward war-related production, either propaganda films or training films for the armed services, or And that's a whole fascinating story in itself. But at that point, Mickey and the Beanstalk, along with lots of other projects, went on the shelf. So then, after the war was over, they pulled these things back off the shelf and started working with them again. But that gap in between, that 4 or 5 year gap, meant that there was necessarily a whole lot of turnover in the animation department. And so you had artists picking up scenes that had been started 5 years earlier, often by other artists, and complete them. And then you had some scenes that actually had been finished, but were now going to be combined with new material in a kind of patchwork. And it got to be pretty fascinating to sort through all that and see how each of these things fit together.
I found that I learned so much from those different parts of the journey, and I actually revisited the film this evening right before we talked. But I'm curious, how many times did you have to watch the movie as you were putting this book together? But also, we'd love to hear about the first time you saw this film.
Well, it wasn't, believe me, it wasn't a hardship. but typically when I'm working on a project like this, typically what I'm doing is working on one particular part of the film at a time. So for example, the sequence of the Beanstalk growing up through during the night, that was kind of a discrete section in itself, and I would be watching sections of that over and over and seeing how the different elements work together in that. So more often than not, I wasn't watching the complete film in one sitting. I would be just taking one part of it and really examining that. But as far as the first time I saw it, I think I actually had the same experience that you had, in that I saw the separate pieces on television, and especially Mickey and the Beanstalk. And you're right, by the time it made it to television, it was a completely different film, because they went on adapting. That's what they did at Disney. So, and in the case of Mickey, the framing story of Edgar Bergen and his dummies, they were tremendous. Edgar Bergen was a tremendous star in 1947. And by the time Mickey and the Beanstalk was shown on television, they were kind of moving away from featuring him as much as that. So at one point it was repurposed with Sterling Holloway, who of course is a familiar voice throughout a big chunk of Disney history, and so he became the narrator off screen. And then, still later, it was redone again, and this time Ludwig von Drake became the narrator. So it was still an extremely pliable project through all those years, and I think a lot of us saw that for the first time in one of those later forms. But for me, being that I loved the films of the 40s and earlier so much, it was such a treat to finally see it with the original framing elements like that.
Yeah, the version I remember seeing as a kid was on VHS. I'm from the 90s. And I remember, I think it had Ludwig von Drake as the intro. I seriously remember, I think it was that one and not another film, because I do not remember seeing Bergman and the ventriloquist. That was a total new surprise to me when I watched this film a week or so ago while I was reading the book, because I had no idea that was there, because that was not the version I remembered. So I think the VHS form that I remember as a kid did come from those later television versions.
Yeah, and if you would like to sometime, it's a really interesting thing to put some of those versions side by side.
Oh, I bet.
An appreciation of the adaptive work that they went through, to translate it from one purpose to another, because the animation, it's the most expensive thing you can do is go in and rework the animation. It's very expensive, and it's never really satisfying because it's so hard to match animation or animated elements with something that was made 20 or 30 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in every case they kept the animation exactly as it was and figured out how to rework the animation the narration so that it would fit exactly with the existing elements and would flow gracefully and look seamless. And of course they pulled it off. They're professionals. They know what they're doing. But it's fascinating to see the means by which they arrived at that.
I'm not sure I ever even saw Mickey and the Beanstalk, but I think I was aware of Willie the Giant and maybe saw like bits and pieces of it. But I know for a fact, I watched this for the first time maybe 3 years ago. We kind of got into collecting the digital versions on Blu-ray ahead of Disney Plus. And I remember starting it, and I had never heard of Bongo. And I was like, what is this short that I've never seen? I haven't seen this character appear in anything. So that was such a treat for me. Emily and I are both big Disney fans, but to kind of see something you haven't seen, you're like, oh, I thought I covered it all. And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it is. And in the case of Bongo, I think you're right. I think a lot of people tend or let's put it this way: people are more likely to have seen Mickey and the Beanstalk than to have seen Bongo. And I think one of the reasons for that is, and you know this if you've read the book, it's based on a story by Sinclair Lewis. Well, of course, Sinclair Lewis is one of the great American authors. He's a big name in American literature, and it's pretty unusual for Disney. It was especially unusual at that time for Disney to adapt a story from an author like that. But Lewis evidently did intend this as a children's story, although his version is considerably different from what Disney made out of it on the screen. But he was a well-known author. Lots and lots of classic films have been made from his stories. And so by the time he was approached to sell this story to Disney, he knew when he went to negotiate with the movie studio. So he was very, very careful to relinquish only certain rights to the story. And I think that is one of the reasons that Bongo hasn't been shown as much. It was simply the fact that Lewis retained a lot of the rights for himself, and then, following that, his estate has taken over the same rights.
That might solve a mystery that I have. Have you been to Walt Disney World in Florida relatively recently? Like maybe within the past 5 years?
Not recently, no.
Okay.
No.
As part of the new Fantasyland expansion in 2012, they added the Storybook Circus section, which took over Mickey's Toontown Fair. Kind of moved Dumbo over there. And there's these posters of different Disney characters in circus acts. I think Pluto performs with other dogs. Daisy is a fortune teller. But there's a bear on a unicycle, but it's Humphrey the bear from some of those Donald Duck shorts. And I'm like, wait, after I saw Bongo, I'm like, why is this not Bongo? But it must be the legal rights side of things.
That's really interesting, and I bet you're right.
Once the parks reopen, I'll get a picture for you and email it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah, that combination of those two characters, that's a really interesting wrinkle, and no, I had not heard about that.
So JB, we're ready to, we've already been talking about the book, but let's dive a little bit more into the book, and we kind of want to start at the end of your book. In your final analysis, kind of summarizing the film Fun and Fancy Free, you call it a comfortable film. So why do you think those words describe this picture?
Well, I think it's a function of the time that it was made. I think if either or Mickey and the Beanstalk or both had been made at the time, had been finished and released at the time that Walt was first planning them, they would have been very different from what we see in Fun and Fancy Free. But by the time they came back to these projects and put them together in the post-war years, I think that Walt and his artists had grown up a little more, and they had just been through these years. You know, this, and I made something of this in the book. Their generation had been through a worldwide depression and then a world war in quick succession, and the war was finally over. I think a lot of people were really ready to embrace peacetime and settle down and put all of that trauma behind them. And I get, and you know, other people, but I as a viewer get a feeling of real relaxation with Fun and Fancy Free. These are artists who know what they're doing. You know, they've had long experience. They know exactly how to put one of these films together. But there's a feeling of contentment, I think, that underlies the whole film. And this, I think that you just get a sense of the sort of the zeitgeist of the time. You know, that filmmakers and probably audiences, a lot of them, were ready to settle down and enjoy the luxury of not being at war and being able to face a more or less secure future. And so there's plenty of fast action in the film and plenty of conflict and so on. But for me, the overriding feeling is one of comfort and being able to sort of settle down and enjoy the fruits of what you've been doing all that time. So even the music, you know, Dinah Shore's song, she has several songs in the Bongo section, but one of them is Lazy Countryside. And it's just about relaxing and enjoying the beauty of nature. And that song, of all the songs in the film, that was the one that became a modest hit. It was more successful than any of the others. I think there's a reason for that. I think that a lot of people were ready to just take that attitude and relax and enjoy life a little bit.
Yeah, that post-war time period is definitely, you know, known for those package films, and they reflect those values. But I'm curious, how do you think Fun and Fancy Free stands out from the other package films?
Well, this could get a little complex, but
no
you
problem.
know, there are different kinds of package films. That's one of the things I think is fascinating about them. And at the time that this was made, they had not yet tackled something like this that is essentially a double feature. You know, Make My Music had been kind of a pop music version of Fantasia, and certainly nothing wrong with that. I love that film, and in fact, I'm starting to work on that one now. But that's one kind of package film. This was like a double feature, and there actually had been some live action. There right around this same time. In fact, there were some live action films that were made along similar lines. There's one called Dead of Night that's like a horror film, but it's like two separate stories combined in one film. And Fun and Fancy Free is that, but in animation. And I think that there's something kind of special about that. You know, that you're seeing your familiar old friends, Jiminy Cricket and Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and so on, but you're also seeing some new ones. And in this package that gives you just enough of the variety of a double feature that you feel like you've had a real meal by the time it's all over. And which is not to say that Make My Music isn't satisfying, but it's satisfying in a different way, I think. And as you know, there was only one further package film that was made along the same lines as Fun and Fancy Free, and that was The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, and which also is likewise a really, really fun and entertaining double feature. but without any of the familiar characters that we had already grown to love over the years from other Disney films. So
That's another one I had. I'm sorry. Ichabod and Mr. Toad was another one I had on VHS, and I'm curious if it also had similar adaptations, that what I saw on my 1995 VHS tape might be very different than when it was produced in the late 40s.
Well, I'll let you know when I get to that one. but it's inevitably there are going to be some adaptations, because I know The Legend of Sleepy Hollow has been shown also many times on television, and inevitably when you pull it out of the overall structure of the feature-length film, there are inevitably going to be some changes in the way they get into the story. So yeah, I think that likely you will see some key differences there.
I want to go back to talking about Jiminy Cricket. I was really excited to see him. He's always been one of my favorite characters. But like I said earlier, I grew up with the Ludwig von Drake intro on the VHS tape from the later adaptations. So why do you think Jiminy Cricket, you talk about this in your book, is perfect as a host for Fun and Fancy Free?
Well, I think that goes back to the nature of his character. A few years back, I wrote an in-depth account of the making of Pinocchio. And of course, Jiminy Cricket was designed for Pinocchio. And we could talk all day about Jiminy Cricket, because he's such an interesting and unique character. Of course, you know that Pinocchio was based on a novel written in Italy in the late 19th century, and which had very briefly a talking cricket. The cricket translated into Jiminy Cricket in the Disney film. And one of the things that I found fascinating, and there are many fascinating things about Pinocchio, but one of the things I found fascinating was that the characters in the film seem to represent a whole international cast. You know, some of them are recognizably Italian, some seem to be more German. You know, Geppetto comes across as more of a Germanic character. And Lampwick seems like kind of a Lower East Side tough from the United States. So in the middle of all this, you have Jiminy Cricket, who is unmistakably an American character and a kind of a contemporary one in 1940 terms. And that has a lot to do with the casting of Cliff Edwards as his voice. So here in the middle of this story that's taking place in sort of old world Europe with an international cast, right in the middle of that is this contemporary, very American sort of character who talks directly to the camera, and that in itself was an unusual thing at the time, and it wasn't a decision that they arrived at easily, but as you know, it turned out to work beautifully in the context of the film, and so because of that, Jiminy Cricket became a really unique character, and Cliff Edwards let it be known when the film was finished that he would just love to come back and work for Disney some more. So, and in fact, he did provide other voices for other cartoons. You know, he provided a voice for Dumbo, and you can hear his voice on the soundtrack of several of the wartime public service films. I think the idea of bringing him back was never far from the story department's mind, because he was such a versatile character that he could fit into a variety of settings. So when the decision was made to combine Bongo and Mickey and the Beanstalk into one feature-length film, it wasn't a difficult decision to create a master of ceremonies and let Jiminy Cricket fill that role. And once again, he talks directly to the camera. You know, he's speaking to the audience at that time, you know, speaking to the audience in the theater. And he's just a perfect host. And I think it's kind of lovely to see how they crafted these different pieces so that his part of the story flows directly into both of the other stories. And of course, he is combined on the screen with Edgar Bergen and his action talent in the Mickey and the Beanstalk section of the film.
What this reminded me of reading about how they picked Jiminy Cricket, it kind of reminded me of them picking Tinkerbell to be one of the characters on the screen with Walt for the Disneyland specials on TV, because they needed to pick a character that they could use in such a versatile way. So I thought that was really cool how Jiminy Cricket kind of predated the Tinkerbell getting on TV, that he busted out of his role in his film first. So I think it's really interesting how he can be such a versatile character and really be placed anywhere, much like Tinkerbell, Mickey, Minnie, Pluto, Donald, Goofy, all of them can be as well.
That's right. And again, it was really, of course, Mickey and the other characters from the shorts are pretty infinitely adaptable. But it was, at the time, it was really unusual to take a character from one of the feature-length films and pull him out of that universe and plant him in another one. And it couldn't have been done with a lot of characters, but with Jiminy Cricket, he is such a versatile type that it worked out fine. And as you know, it didn't stop with fun and fancy free. They also found lots of ways on television when a few years later they got into television in a big way. So he shows up on the Disneyland anthology series, but he also showed up quite a bit on the Mickey Mouse Club during the day. So when I was, as I say, I always think of writing a book about a film as an excuse to do the research. So when I was writing about Pinocchio, I took the opportunity to really delve into some kind of deep background on Jiminy Cricket. And it's kind of amazing all of the different uses that they found for that character once he had been created for Pinocchio. And yeah, you're right. That kind of set a precedent for things like the reuse of Tinkerbell.
Courtney, correct me if I'm wrong. They also used Jiminy Cricket in the parks as the host of Wishes and I think Spectro Magic.
Yes, both of those. I miss them dearly.
So he even jumped off the screen and into the theme parks as a host.
Yeah, he gets around.
I wanted to go back to something we had mentioned earlier. Both Bongo and Mickey and the Beanstalk went through years of rotating animators and story edits. Based on your research, do you think the shorts turned out for the best, or were there too many compromises? Like, was there something that you read about that you wish maybe would have stayed within the script?
Well, it is fascinating to contemplate some of the ideas that they considered and then didn't use. I never like to second guess an artist, and generally when Walt made a decision or when the writers made a decision, there was a good reason for it. But some of the things that they considered do seem pretty fascinating, and it would be tempting to imagine what they might be like. When they went through a period on Mickey and the Beanstalk where the three heroes arrived at the top of the Beanstalk and then started having some wild adventures with the gigantic creatures that lived up there. And this gets into. Do you mind if we take another side road here?
That is absolutely fine.
Okay. Well, one of the things that you discover right away about the Disney short subjects of the 1930s is that when they started developing really exciting, dynamic characters besides Mickey, and in particular Donald, Duck, and Goofy, one of the first things that came out of that was the Mickey, Donald, Goofy trio cartoon, and they made some really entertaining cartoons with that formula. But I think the ingenious thing about it was that it was a really economical use of their resources, because they would introduce the three characters together doing something. You know, they would be working together on something or trying to accomplish something together. And then they would split up, and each one of the three would have a series of gags of his own. And that way you got them away from each other to be animated separately by an artist or a group of artists who specialized in that character. And they could all be working simultaneously. And then you could bring all the characters back together at the end for some big wrap-up. So it was not only an entertaining formula, it was also a really economical use of resources, you know, with the animators all being able to work separately at the same time. So the Mickey cartoon became kind of a standard staple of the short subjects. And for a while, during the making of Mickey and the Beanstalk, they were going to do kind of an expanded version of one of those when the characters got to the top of the beanstalk. So Mickey and Donald and Goofy would each run into separate adventures of their own. So in Mickey's case, he was going to encounter a herd of grasshoppers that were the size of horses from his perspective, and actually saddle and ride one of them. And they came up with several different ideas for Donald. And in fact, one of the ideas that they came up with, they actually wound up producing separately as a short cartoon, completely apart from Fun and Fancy Free. So it would have been interesting to see how that all played out, because for a while, Walt was so intrigued with that idea that he told the writers to just forget everything else and concentrate on those, what they called the breakout sequences. And for a little while before the war, that was the primary push in making Mickey and the Beanstalk. Well, of course, in the finished film, there's no sign of that at all. They get to the top of the beanstalk, discover where they are, and create a giant teapot to use as a boat in crossing the moat to the castle, and they just hop into that and take off. And you know, you get the giant dragonflies, but other than that, you don't have any of the giant creatures that at one time they were going to encounter in that part of the story. So pardon me for running on at length about that, but I think that there was a reason for that to happen the way it did. But if they had followed that idea and stayed with it, it would have completely changed the character of the film.
Do you have a favorite short out of the two, Bongo or Mickey and the Beanstalk?
I don't think I have. You know, at this point, you know, after you've finished writing a book like this,
I know I'm asking you to pick a favorite child right now.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I get asked sometimes what my favorite Disney film is, and I could never narrow it down to just one. But you know, it is a little like picking a favorite child. I can tell you that there seems to be a general consensus that Mickey and the Beanstalk is a stronger individual story than Bongo. And in some ways I can understand that, but I have kind of a soft spot for Bongo.
I do too.
There's some really good stuff going on there, animation-wise. You know, as you know, both of these stories have the services of some of the best animators in the studio, and so I really don't like to play one off against the other. So yeah, I'm going to hold out for Bongo too.
That's fair. You know, I feel like Mickey and the Beanstalk definitely feels like, as you said, that classic Mickey, Donald, Goofy trio. But I was going to share that Bongo's my favorite just for, as I shared the first time watching it, I was so blown away that I had never seen it. So it feels special to me in that regard. What about you, Emily?
I'm in the Mickey and the Beanstalk camp.
No problem.
I think just from growing up with it, that was one that my mom was a big fan of putting on sing-alongs before bed because it made me feel like I watched a whole movie, but it was only 25 minutes. And this was in the rotation because Mickey and the Beanstalk wasn't super long. So I grew up on Mickey and the Beanstalk. So that was I have a real soft spot for that one. So Bongo was super charming, and I enjoyed watching Bongo, but I'm a Mickey and the Beanstalk fan.
Well, that's good. And the good news is that you don't have to vote for just one or the other because
they're together.
In Fun and Fancy Free, you get them both for the price of one. And it is. I mean, it doesn't have a long. The film at large doesn't have a long running time, but you do. I think you do come away from it feeling that you've had a full meal because you've had both of these stories, and each one plays out with just the amount of time it needs to really register.
So we want to go back to the transitions between Bongo and Mickey and the Beanstalk. You had talked about the role of Ed Bergen, but this was, I know for me, the biggest surprise and unexpected piece of this Disney film. I was not expecting a ventriloquist to be this transition, but you had a really interesting chapter. I watched the film first before I read the book. And so I was a little, why would this be here? But then you explain it so well in your book about his role. So could you give us a synopsis about why it was important that he was in this film?
I don't know if everyone realizes this now, but he was a tremendous star at the time. I think in more recent years, it's likely that a lot of people only know of Edgar Bergen as the father of Candice Bergen. But in fact, he was a tremendous star at the time. Radio, I guess it seems counterintuitive now to think that a ventriloquist would become a big star on the radio, but in fact, Bergen did, and he became a very big star during the I believe starting in the late 20s and on into the 1930s. He and his dummies, he had the two dummies, Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snurd, and he actually had others too, but those were the two best known ones. He started making appearances in movies as early as the late 20s, and he was just a really, really big star. And it wasn't so much because of his great ventriloquist skills. It had more to do with the personalities of the two dummies, and especially Charlie McCarthy. Are you familiar with any of his stuff apart from Fun and Fancy Free?
No, I think that would be a good thing to look into after as an additional resource. We often like to include those in the show notes. I particularly enjoyed in the book hearing about Charlie McCarthy's on-air radio feud with Donald Duck, so I'd love to track that down if I could.
Yeah. Well, that was par for the course with Charlie McCarthy, because that was again the great popularity of Bergen as a ventriloquist had to do with the popularity of the characters that he created. And in particular Charlie McCarthy, because he was a little wise ass, he was really incorrigible, and you could always count on him to say the wrong thing. He had lots of wisecracks. So he had kind of a famous radio feud with W.C. Fields, and of course, there wasn't anything to it. It was just done for fun, because Fields was a big star at the time too. And so to hear these two characters carrying on as if they hated each other, but just by means of wisecracks, that was something that radio to, and it was writing character for Charlie McCarthy. Well, so when you came to, and in fact, I don't know whether this is well known, but this was not the first brush that the Disney universe had with Edgar Bergen, because his radio show was so popular that in many instances it was used to help publicize new Disney films when they were coming out. Walt and Edgar Bergen were personal friends, and to let his radio show be kind of a venue for helping to promote the latest Disney film. So for example, when Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was about to be released, Snow White and the Dwarfs were guests one week on the Edgar Bergen radio show, and of course, Charlie McCarthy got into a squabble with Grumpy right away because they were two real argumentative characters who ticked each other off as soon as they both walked into the room. So it was a natural thing to do the same thing with Donald Duck at the time that Fun and Fancy Free was about to be released. And it was good publicity. People got a kick out of hearing these characters, attack each other verbally with wisecracks.
Yeah, do you know if that's available anywhere, like YouTube or something? I don't know. People didn't quite record the radio back then, I guess.
Well, no, there are transcriptions of those shows.
Okay.
I've got some recordings here, and I don't remember now where I got them. I think it was from a radio collector. I do think they can be found online, and if you'd like, I can check on that after we have this conversation. I can check on it, and I can let you know.
We'd love that. Emily and I are both avid readers, as I'm sure you can tell, but we're also big research fans as well, so we won't mind the challenge if you can't find them.
Okay, well, that makes us kindred spirits. But yeah, if I can find something that might be helpful, I will pass it along.
Yeah, I definitely related at the beginning of the show when you said that you were more excited about the research than the writing. I had some flashbacks to senior year of college writing my history thesis for my final, where I was so much more excited about being in the library and going to the Library of Congress than I was actually sitting down at the computer and typing it all out. I related to that.
Well, you and me both. But I will add, though, that, as I say, I didn't start out interested in being a writer, but once I started doing it, I did get a lot more interested in the whole craft of wordsmithing. And in fact, I've become more of a reader since then and have started becoming more familiar with, the great American writers, everybody from, Mark Twain to Raymond Chandler, and kind of soaking up their writings and
that actually lends itself well to a question we like to often ask our guests, and that's, what advice do you have for writers who might be interested in writing about Disney or any topic of their choice?
Well, the best single piece of advice that I can give is write about something that you love, because if you're going to do it well, you need to know what you're talking about, and it does require lots of research. So if you take a topic and living with that topic for some time, and if it's something that you love, then you will not feel that it's any hardship to keep pursuing the research. Every book that I've written has involved not only a lot of Disney research, but side roads that lead into other areas that I hadn't even really considered before. So in the case of, I wrote a book once on the Disney Good Neighbor films that were made during World War II, the Latin American films. And in doing that, I wound up learning a lot about the Latin American cultures that Disney was portraying on the screen. I learned a lot about of World War II history, because that whole project took place against the backdrop of World War II. And I learned a lot about, I wound up going to the Rockefeller Archive Center because the films were made for the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, who happened to be Nelson Rockefeller. And sure enough, there was material there at the Rockefeller Archive Center in New York State that I couldn't find anywhere else. And so it's a wonderful learning opportunity, both within the Disney universe and outside in other areas. Same thing with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I wound up getting a crash course in the history of folklore because the story had started as an oral tradition. So, that's the thing. Pick a topic that you love and then just go after it and keep plugging away and looking for more and more information, because you'll be surprised how much there is out there.
And then finally, to wrap up our conversation, another question we like to ask our authors and guests is, what is a Disney book from your shelf that you would like to recommend to our listeners?
You're talking about books that I admire by other writers?
Yes.
Okay.
And you're also free to plug your other books as well.
Well, obviously, you need to have every one of my books.
Silly Symphony Companion, like I said, has been on my wish list for a while. I think I'm going to make the jump now that I have a lot more time to read.
Yeah, and I might add that and one other book I wrote with my good friend Russell Merritt, and he has a giant share of the credit for those books, because he is a brilliant film historian. The first book that I ever wrote, and it was his too, was one that we collaborated on together. It's called Walt in Wonderland, and it's about the silent films of Walt Disney. And at the time we wrote it, that was an almost completely unexplored field, and a lot more people have picked up on it since then. But that was really for both of us, kind of an introduction into writing books about Disney. And so I want to make sure that he gets a full share of the credit, because he's a brilliant guy and a great historian, and largely and responsible for a lot of what is good about both of those books. But the Silly Symphony book, I can tell you, was originally published in 2006, and then in an expanded, updated version in 2016, a 10th anniversary edition. So I hope you'll be happy with it when you see it. But I can tell you that I'm really proud of that, and I'm really proud of Russell's contribution to it. But as far as other books are concerned, I would say you can't go wrong with anything by John Canemaker. He really paved the way for a lot of us in writing comprehensive books about Disney history. Picking out just one of his is difficult, but I have a real fondness for a book that he wrote called Before the Animation Begins, which was his salute to the great concept artists at the Disney studio. Are you already familiar with that one?
No, we're not. That's why I always love having people share, because it just makes our list grow.
Okay, well, I would definitely recommend that. Well, you've already talked to Didier. I would say that, and you're familiar with his They Drew As They Pleased series.
Yes, we just did the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, that's he's done some really outstanding work with that. I would say, in addition to that, you should check out, he wrote a book called Disney's Grand Tour about the trip that Walt and Roy and their wives made to Europe in 1935. He really broke that down in detail. And being, a native European himself, he had a really unique perspective on that, and was able to color outside the lines, and go beyond what would be immediately obvious within the Disney universe. So I'd recommend that. And Mike Barrier is, I don't know, you may know, he's one of the very best animation historians in the world, and not just Disney animation, but all of the major studios. And he did a great book a number of years back called Hollywood Cartoons, so I would recommend that. and I'm probably leaving out some really great stuff, and will hate myself after after the conversation is over. But I would say, and if you don't mind, I will also get in a plug for the HHA monograph series, because, as I say, Jim Hollifield and I are the editors of the series, and that means that we get to see all of these projects in development. And there are some really, really exciting titles coming. I won't run through all of them right now, but I can tell you that some of them are very close to being ready for publication, and it covers a wide spectrum of topics, both animation and theme parks and lots of other.
Well, those all sound like excellent recommendations. As I said before, our list continues to grow. But in our next episode, we'll be joined by a guest reader, our podcast host friend, Brett Nachman from Notably Disney. Brett hosted us last year on episode 9 to discuss Yesterday's Tomorrow by John Hahn. And we joined him again on episode 26 for a Disney Tunes and Quotes trivia game. So I think it's about time that we host Brett over here on our show as a guest reader to discuss Imagineer Kevin Rafferty's book, Magic Journey, My Fantastical Walt Disney Imagineering Career. Rafferty's book was just released in 2019 and was actually on our Christmas list for all three of us, so we thought it would be the perfect book for us to get together and talk about in a few weeks. So here's the description of Rafferty's memoir.
A 40-year storied career, beginning in the dish room at the Plaza Inn in Disneyland, Kevin Rafferty has conceived, designed, written, and overseen the creation of some of the Disney parks' most memorable attractions, including Typhoon Lagoon and Blizzard Beach water parks, Cars Land, Toy Story Mania, Test Track, Tower of Terror, Muppet Vision, and many others, including the first ever Mickey and Minnie Mouse attraction to debut at Walt Disney World, Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway. For a young man who began studying for the priesthood at a seminary, the journey to the halls of Imagineering has truly been a magical one. A master storyteller, Kevin chronicles his unimaginable career with great humor, honesty, and heart.
That should be a lot of fun. In the meantime, you can keep up with us for Book of the Mouse Club on Twitter and Instagram at Book of the Mouse. You can email us with comments or ideas to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. And please be sure to leave us a review on iTunes so that others can find our podcast and read and listen along with us. I do have to give a shout out to our John 4, who gave us 4 stars and said, with so many outstanding books released lately that focus on Disney history, I'd love to hear from those authors, Didier Guez, J.B.Kaufman, and others featured on future podcasts. Well, John, you got your wish. We've had both of those in this month, so that's been a lot of fun. If you want to keep up with me personally, I'm on Instagram at GreatGuthsby and on Twitter at Courtney_Guth.
And you can follow me, Emily, on Instagram and Twitter at Emily_McD. And then, JB, let us know what is the best way for our listeners to keep up with you and also buy your books.
Well, I have probably the best way is just to go to my website, which is just my name, J.B.Kaufman.com. I am very careful to make sure that all of my books are featured there, but I also try to include some other content so that it's not just, so that there is something that you might enjoy reading, and all of my books are listed there with a link to Amazon, so that you can buy them that way. And so I think that's the best way you can go. When this epidemic is over and you can get back to bookstores, they should be available wherever fine books are sold. But in the meantime, and even after that, Amazon is probably the easiest way to go.
I'm also going to include the link to the Hyperion Historical Alliance Press as well in our show notes so that we can keep up with all their great projects and monographs as well.
Absolutely, yes. And again, I think you're going to be excited to see some of the things that are coming.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And as we always like to close out our show, we have our guest share a quote to close it out since they're the guest of honor. What have you brought to share with us today?
Well, I think the thing I can give you, and this is something that I really like a lot personally. I have this in the book. You've probably seen it. But at the time that Fun and Fancy Free was about to be released, Walt Disney did a transcribed radio program called The Story of Mickey Mouse, in which he gave kind of a potted biography of Mickey Mouse, who was really turning 19, but they all pretended that he was about to turn 20 because that sounds better. And so Walt gave this little talk about Mickey's career, and it's charming to listen to because you can tell that he has a real sense of nostalgia and a real sense of affection for this little fictional character who has done so much to define the universe of Disney. And in the course of it, he acknowledged the role that he had always played in providing Mickey's voice for the soundtracks of the films. But I think at the end, he didn't want to spoil the illusion for younger listeners. So at the end of the talk, he wound up simply by saying, "He still speaks for me, and I still speak for him."
Aw, that's very sweet. And we're grateful that you joined to speak with us today. So thank you once again, and have a great evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Of the Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.